Now, I suppose there's some of you that wonder why you're here. Well, I suppose you thought that all it was reading a brochure and putting down your money and coming here. It's a lot more than that, folks. And you shouldn't go away from here without knowing what's behind it all. The reason that you're here, basically, I contend, centers around the interaction between two dynamic Americans. Their names are John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Their interaction, I think, is why you're here. Now, you know John Muir was that Scots boy, don't you? Came from Scotland to that area around Portage, Wisconsin. His father brought him. His father was a fundamentalist, itinerant preacher and farmer. Preached on Sunday and farmed 16 hours a day, and made his son, John Muir, farm 16 hours a day to try to make a farm out of that sandy loam. But there was Sunday. And what happened on Sunday is critical to your understanding why you're here. On Sunday, this itinerant preacher, father, Daniel Muir, would allow no book in the house, and 7 days a week, no book in the house other than the King James Version of the Bible. Furthermore, on Sunday, he required that his son John memorize the King James Version of the Bible. By the time John was 11 or 12, he had memorized the whole New Testament, the whole Old Testament by heart, word for word. That has significance for you. John Muir became one of the great writers and speakers of the late 1800s. He was incapable of speaking without the flair of that great work of literature called the King James Version of the Bible. His writing had that swing to it. How could it help but be? He was immersed in that book at his early age. So he was able to handle the English language in a way that caused you to be here. He wrote about his passion. His passion was wilderness. He wrote and talked about the idea of wilderness being of value in and of itself, beyond extractive resources. He convinced hundreds and thousands of Americans in the late 1800s, because of his ability to write and speak, that they should pay more attention to wilderness. You know, he grew up a fundamentalist like his father, and then as he watched how glaciers changed the face of the earth, he changed his theology and he became a pantheist, one who sees God in nature. So he changed his theology, and this is the way that we understand how he changed it. And this also shows you a little bit about his writing. One learns that the world, though made, is yet being made. That this is the morning of creation. That mountains long conceived are now being born, brought to light by the glaciers, channels traced for rivers, basins hollowed for lakes, that moraine soil is being ground and outspread for coming plants, while the finest part of the grist, seen hastening far out to sea, is being stored away in the darkness and builded particle on particle, cementing and crystallizing to make the mountains and valleys and plains of other landscapes, which, like fluent, pulsing water, rise and fall and pass on through the ages in endless rhythm and beauty. Now you've got to admit, he does have a flair for language. You can see how he changed his theology. Is there anybody here from California? Muir had something in here for Californians. Yes, here it is. All are more or less sick. There is not a perfectly sane man in San Francisco. Now, if you didn't like that one, you'll like this one. This is about the national forest here. No doubt these trees would make good lumber after passing through a sawmill, as George Washington, after passing through the hands of a French cook, would have made good food. Think about that one for a minute. Well, anyway, one of those that he was read by was a man named Teddy Roosevelt. He happened to be President of the United States. He read Muir, was moved by Muir, and wrote Muir a letter. And the letter asked Muir if he'd like to go camping with him. Now, can you imagine the President of the United States writing to a man he'd never met and asking him if he'd like to go camping? Let's think about Bill Clinton for a minute. I didn't mean to touch a nerve. Let's not. Anyway, that's what happened to Roosevelt. He wrote to Muir, and Muir accepted. And in 1903, they camped together in Yosemite at Bridal Veil Falls. Have you been there? Maybe you remember the plaque that's there. It shows their camping place. They camped there 4 days and nights. Snow fell on their sleeping bags. Roosevelt refused to go to the banquet that they had in town for him. He stayed and talked with Muir. And now we're coming to you. After that camping trip, in 1907, President Roosevelt put his name on a piece of paper that designated this as the Tongass National Forest, the largest one of them all, and I'm suggesting to you that had he not done that, it would all be developed, all be logged, there wouldn't be anything much for you to see, and you probably wouldn't be here. I'm suggesting to you that you're here basically because of the meeting of two dynamic Americans that influenced the history of this country so much that thousands of people come here to see what they've left for us. That thousands of people come to enjoy what is their forest. You are parked, tied up, right in the middle of one of the largest commercial fleets in the world. Well, maybe you thought Petersburg was a small town. Maybe you're judging bigness in an erroneous way. Maybe you're using that old-fashioned way of judging bigness in terms of numbers of people in town. Are you doing that? Well, let me suggest a different way. Let me suggest a more appropriate way of measuring size. Let's measure size and bigness in terms of annual value of seafood processed and see how your village comes out against my village. Well, we're somewhere between 4th and 10th largest city in North America. If you measure bigness in terms of annual value of seafood processed, and that's how we're going to measure it today because I'm the one with the microphone on. So that's what we're going to do. Well, what do we do here? 5 kinds of salmon, 4 kinds of shrimp, 3 kinds of crab, herring roe for the Japanese folks, that marvelous flatfish called the halibut, of which this is a symbol, black cod or sablefish, beginning fisheries in sea urchin and sea cucumber. So we have, our heritage has always been commercial fishing. We're looking at the Mary Ann. Now, Mary Ann's one of the big fishing boats in Petersburg Harbor, and around it there's lots of others. The Mary Ann's owned by Darrell and Mary Ann Olson, and they've been fishing salmon, and this boat's been fishing salmon for a lot of years. I think I could come pretty close and say 34 years for Darrell fishing salmon with this boat. Well, it's a seine boat, and there's the seine. And the way salmon are caught with a seine is that seine skiff takes the end of the seine off the boat, makes a circle around the salmon, around the school of salmon, and then they have the ability to purse that seine up at the bottom so that the salmon can't swim back out again. That's the key to it. The other key to it, of course, is that they're only allowed to fish a certain number of hours or days per week, and that goes by weekly announcement, and that's what controls the take of the fish so that you don't take too many. So they can't fish all the time, they can't fish in any area that they want to, and the seine has limitations on it. It can only be 250 fathoms long by about 16 or 18 fathoms deep. The seine skiff that you see is a really important and expensive part of the whole operation. Pretty small boat, isn't it? But it's got an enormous diesel engine in it. So if you had to just purchase the seine boat, it'd probably be around $60,000. So you get a little clue as to the capital investment it takes to fish salmon. But salmon is one of the heartbeats of the seafood industry, and Petersburg, of course, is at the center of that industry, and salmon is really important. And so people like Darrell and Mary Ann Olson are important to our economy and important to feed the whole country. Now, a seiner can't make a living just by seining salmon. So one of the things that you need to remember about commercial fishing is that we have to be diversified. You can't make a living just seining salmon anymore. We're in South Harbor of Petersburg, and you're looking at some of these family-owned boats here, these diversified boats, each one of which represents a business in Petersburg, a fishing business. And now we're getting to the Galatea, and we're going to pick out the Galatea and mention some things about that in particular. The Galatea is another family-owned boat here in Petersburg. Gary and Christy Slavin own the Galatea and have for a long time, a beautiful boat, as are most of the boats in Petersburg, beautifully maintained. But the thing to remember about the Galatea as you look at it is that it's rigged for longline fishing for halibut right now. You see the portable house on the back end of the boat that comes off when they're done with halibut fishing, and that's called the bait house, and that's where baiting is done, and the tubs are prepared for longlining for that wonderful flatfish halibut and also sablefish, black cod. Well, anyway, the Galatea is diversified. A diversified family business with a great investment before you can go fishing. They fish brown crab, they fish tanner crab, Gary fishes Dungeness crab, he seines for salmon, he longlines for halibut, he longlines for black cod, and sometimes, at least he used to, I know, fish herring roe for the Japanese folks. So the bottom line is, a fisherman in Petersburg has to be diversified to make a living, and Gary Slavin on the Galatea is a good example of that. So seining salmon is about over this year, and these seine boats are lining up one after the other to offload their gear. Now, a seine fisherman, that's an S-E-I-N-E, we don't have any of the other kind. A seine fisherman can only go fishing if he has a limited entry permit. That's the license that entitles him to take salmon. Virtually all of our fisheries are managed, as a part of the management, is limited entry certification. Now, isn't it ironic that in the state of Alaska, the state legislature debated this concept of limiting entry for fishermen during the same session that they debated legalizing prostitution? Well, think about it for a minute. But unfortunately for some, they did not legalize prostitution. But they did create the limited entry law, which limits the number of boats that can fish that specific species with that specific kinds of gear in that specific area. So a seine boat fisherman has got one of those, and a gill net fisherman, gill netting is catching salmon by entanglement. A gill net fisherman has one of those limited entry certificates, which really means that only 450 fishermen can legally take salmon using a gill net in southeast Alaska. Forever. And so what this means is that I hold my limited entry certificate for drift gill netting salmon in perpetuity. So how can anybody else get to go fishing? Well, they can't until I or some other fisherman is willing to sell. So they have real value. And they go back and forth to people that want to get rid of fishing. They want to get rid of their certificates. They have to do something else, or they're too old to fish anymore. And so they transfer the permit for a price. Now today, if you want to go gill netting, you'll have to pay me about $35,000. That's what the piece of paper will cost today. But it goes up and down like the stock market, and for many of the same reasons. For the perceived value of the fish is what determines the current price of that gill net permit. So all of the fisheries, virtually all of them, shrimp, crab, salmon, herring for sure, are managed with the limited entry concept. Now, halibut's another story. This is a gannion. This is called a gannion. This is a piece of gear that's the terminal gear for longline fishing for halibut. Now, on my boat, when it's time to fish halibut, if I have entitlement to the poundage, now that's a different scheme. Halibut and black cod are managed differently. It's called an IFQ. individual fisherman's quota. So this year I'm entitled to 5,143 pounds of halibut. That's my quota. Now I will go out on the grounds, and I can go any time between March 15th and the 1st of November. But I can't take more than 5,143 pounds. Well, I can take a little more. There is a provision that says that I can catch 10% more and sell it legally, but anything up to 10% over my allotment is then deducted from my next year's allotment. So you see, there's no incentive for me to catch more. And the same thing with the underage. Up to 10% of the underage will be tacked on to my next year's allotment. So here's the idea. We are fishing for sustainability. We are fishing and managing our fisheries in such a way, we hope, that there will be fish to fish and fish to feed you for our children and our grandchildren. That's the idea behind sustainability, where you are allowed only to take the available surplus, to take the TAC, TAC, total allowable catch. So if the biologists do their job, we'll be able to fish in perpetuity. Now, we have done this pretty well with salmon. We have the largest runs of salmon in the history of the industry in Alaska. In the history of 100 years. Can you believe that? I mean, what other industry can you say that about that depends on a natural resource? Our salmon management in Alaska is a model for the rest of the world. Now, who knows if we can continue that? Because there are certain pressures that we have to avoid. We have to avoid management by politics. We have to avoid management by emotion. We have to maintain the scientific principle behind management, or else we're not going to succeed with this idea of sustainability. And that's what we're working on. Well, back to halibut. Now, when I get on the halibut grounds, well, I'm on the latitude and longitude that I want. I've plugged it into my GPS, and maybe it's 200 fathoms deep. Toss over the buoy, mark the thing on the GPS so I know exactly where I started, toss over 200 fathoms of buoy line, that is if I'm in 150 fathoms of water, allowing for the tidal action, tie on a 50-pound anchor, put the boat in gear and on automatic pilot. A crewman stands in the back of the boat, and every 3 fathoms he snaps on one of these baited ganyons. Now, the hook is baited with herring or octopus or squid or salmon or gray cod, depending a little bit on whether or not, well, depending on the price of the bait to the fisherman, and depending a little bit on whether or not he's on hot bottom. Now, hot bottom in this lecture has nothing to do with San Francisco. No. Hot bottom has to do with an area of the ocean floor that is infested with sand fleas. Sand flea is a little critter about like a wood tick. He lives on the floor of the ocean and eats up anything that's down there. So if it is infested with sand fleas, then if you use soft bait like herring, you bring back, the herring will be eaten up shortly by the sand fleas and before the halibut can find the bait. Now, if you leave your line in overnight, the skate line to which this is snapped, if you leave your bait in overnight, then the sand fleas, if it's hot bottom, will eat the halibut up from the inside out, and when you pull back your gear, you will have skin and skeleton and no meat, and sometimes then there is heard on the boat Anglo-Saxon terminology. Well, so some of you can follow this. So hot bottom does have an important precept for us. Now, I suppose there's a couple of questions that could be asked here, but take a look at this hook first. Do you notice the peculiar shape of the hook? It's called a circle hook. Now, contrasting the circle hook, I hope I remember to bring with me the other hook, the J hook. Now, this is what you and I were used to fishing. This hook design's what we were used to fishing when we were kids. When we were fishing for bluegills or bullheads or whatever you used to fish for. Anybody in here ever do that? Well, this is, what, my goodness sakes, you've all been doing that. Well, this is a traditional hook design. It's called a J-hook, and it's the one you and I used. Well, about 10 years ago, a biologist figured out that this hook design had 30% greater hooking efficiency than the old J-hook. So we threw our J-hooks away, and we all bought circle hooks, and we improved our efficiency 30%, thus reducing the number of days we were allowed to fish by a like amount. Well, isn't that the way it works? If you're going to fish for perpetuity, you can never let the fisherman be as efficient as he could be. You can't let the logger be as efficient as he could be. He would take the last tree, the fisherman would take the last fish. So, basic to our industry is management. And that is a biological assessment of the strength of the biomass. If the strength of the biomass is low in my area, southeast Alaska, I won't get 5,143 pounds next year. I might get 4,000 pounds. If the biomass is stronger than it was, I'll get more than that allotment next year, and they'll tell me in a letter at the end of January. So in that way, we're using this perpetuity idea by continually shifting the amount of mounds we take in accord with the strength of the biomass. So we have to keep it scientific, and the science improves all the time, as it does with everything. Now, average commercial weight is somewhere between 20 and 40 pounds. The biggest I caught on my boat was 325 pounds. The biggest one that they weighed was 600 pounds. There are pictures of larger ones, but that were not weighed. The largest sport-caught halibut record today is about 470 pounds. You know, we said there are three ways of catching salmon commercially, and one way is seining, and one way is gill netting, and this is a chunk of gill net off of my boat, and it has a great tendency to get tangled up, and we spend a lot of time trying to get this untangled. But this gives you a notion as to what gill netting is about. A gill net can only be fished in certain small areas in southeast Alaska. Most areas you can't fish a gill net in. We're allowed to fish these in traditional areas that have a high migratory pattern of salmon. Now this weed line is connected to a cork line, and that holds the net up. There's a cork every 40 inches. And then there's a lead line on the bottom that has a tendency to hold the lead down. And so this net can only be, and here's another management criteria, can only be 300 fathoms long. Can't be any more than 300 fathoms long. That's a third of a mile. Can only be 4 fathoms deep. And this mesh that I have here is 5 1/8 inch. Now that's significant because the size of mesh is also a management tool, because you can avoid taking large numbers of a certain kind of salmon if you control the mesh size. Or you can take more numbers of a certain species of salmon by controlling the mesh size. This is designed for sockeye, that wonderful red fish called the sockeye, the world's premium canned fish. You won't see most of it because 80% of our sockeye goes to Japan. Those folks appreciate sockeyes more than we do. They'll pay the price for the sockeye because of the marvelous qualities of this fish meets the Japanese market. Well, this particular mesh size is designed for sockeye salmon. Notice the color here, and then look out there. Do you see how the color of this mesh is chosen to try to match the color of the water there in the area that I'm going to be fishing? So they won't let us use clear monofilament. It's another impediment to efficiency so that there'll always be fish, keeping us from being as efficient as we could be. A salmon that's determined to go back to his stream to spawn may come up to my net on Monday and see the net because they won't let me have clear monofilament. And he pauses. But then with the urge to spawn, can you remember the urge to spawn? Well, I see some do. With the urge to spawn, he plunges into that net, gets caught behind the gills, which is why they call it a gill net. Then I reel him in hydraulically, shake him out of the net, put him in slush ice, and keep him at 32, 32.5 degrees until we get back to town. But you've hit on a key principle. Different strokes for different folks. Different management for different species. For example, see, I can catch all the salmon I am able to catch, but they're going to cut me off on Tuesday noon if the run is not strong. Shrimp, well, their sex life is so interesting. Well, I must tell you. You want to know, don't you? Well, here's the way it is with shrimp. I would think it'd be very confusing to a shrimp. But shrimp are hermaphroditic. Isn't that a tongue twister? They all begin life as male. And they all remain male for 2 or 3 years, and then they all become female. A shrimp can never say, "You don't know what it's like to be a woman," because they're going to be one. So they can't be managed because of this characteristic of sex that they have. So they're managed by poundage per area. In this area here that we're in, quite a large geographic area, 400,000 pounds of shrimp are allowed in 1 month. When that 400,000 pounds is reached, then that area is closed till the beginning of the next month. So you see, it's different than salmon. Each one is different from all the others because of its peculiar biology. Science has to play a very important part in this. The first people here were not the Norwegians. Now, the Norwegians like to claim that they were. The Norwegians have been here a long time. They founded Petersburg 100 years ago. Norwegians are wonderful people. They invented the toilet seat. Germans are the ones that cut the hole in it, but the Norwegians, though, however, they're the ones that invented it, and I think we should give them credit where credit is due. Don't you think so? Well, they weren't the first people here. The Tlingits were, weren't they? And this symbolizes the Tlingit folks, doesn't it? And this is the rattle. And why does it symbolize the Tlingit folks? Well, it's because the oral heritage is critical in understanding Tlingit folks. They didn't have a written language. Hence, when there's something important to pass down to your children or to the rest of the clan or to the whole village, you need to come out with a rattle and get their attention. I last saw the rattle used at George Dalton's funeral. George was a 96-year-old Tlingit chief. He lived in Hoona where we lived, my wife and I. He was a friend of ours, and we were there when he passed away. So we attended his funeral. In the middle of that ceremony, his son Richard Dalton stood up and with a rattle, and in Tlingit, he told us the values of George's life, the values of his father. Well, I was sitting next to a Tlingit person who spoke fluent Tlingit, and she translated for me. So I came away from that funeral with a knowledge of what George had done, and with the memory of the rattle, and having it told in Tlingit. Now, those values will be repeated at an answering potlatch a year later. Somebody in the clan will stand up, maybe Richard again, and he'll reiterate those values of George's life at a potlatch, which is a party. For that purpose. I mean, one of the main purposes, besides having fun and besides to establish social ascendancy, one of the main purposes is to pass down the traditions of the culture. Notice this rattle. Notice that it has the face of a hawk on it. Did you notice that it's not just simply a hawk's face? The rattler's a member of the Hawk clan, very likely. But did you notice it has human characteristics? It's time to understand that Tlingit art is anthropomorphic, that it has characteristics of a wild thing blended with human qualities. That's true of all Tlingit art. So remember that you see human qualities mixed in with that wild thing characteristic. Notice the typical Tlingit colors of red, green, and black. And do you see the abalone for the eyes? And do you see that the spruce root around the handle? And did you notice the back is made of a cockle shell? And no two rattles are alike. Each represents the feelings and the artistic flair of whichever person builds the rattle, makes the rattle. And the rest of it, though, that's the important thing. The rest of it is made of that product so important in Tlingit culture that they do what we human beings have always done. Give feminine characteristics to those things that we admire the most, or those things that we are in awe of. They call her Mother Cedar, yellow cedar, or red cedar. They give her such a compliment that they call her Mother. How can you come up with a greater compliment than that? I wonder if there are any mothers in here. Well, probably one or two. Well, now, it's true, we've always done that with... Didn't they used to name the hurricanes after women? And then they passed a law. But the boats in the harbor, the Teresa Marie, the Jennifer Lee, the Eloise, the Frigid Land. No. not the Frigid Land, but I mean as a rule. Named after our women, aren't they? Well, everything important in Tlingit culture is made of yellow cedar. Take the bentwood box. Now, why do you suppose it is? Why is it that they taught you and me about the wheel and they didn't mention the bentwood box? I think it's a failure in history, teaching of history. Well, imagine the genius of the first native person thousands of years ago, lost in the mists of history. This native person that took a shake of cedar, that's a board, made of cedar, and scored it in 3 places, and steamed it, and bent it, until he or she had achieved 90-degree angles. And then fastened the 4th corner with spruce root, fasten a bottom for it, top for it, steam it some more. Pretty soon you've got a waterproof bentwood box, and they made these things 4 feet square out of yellow cedar, sometimes rectangular, for storage. This one was given to us by Tootsie Fawcett, a little crippled Tlingit lady in Hoona. She called my wife and I in for coffee. We sat there, and pretty soon she gave us this little bentwood box. She said, "This is for trinkets." Then she smiled and said, "Tlingit trinkets." Well, anyway, we treasure it because it reminds us of the importance of cedar in the culture and, of course, reminds us of Tootsie. What about the great brown bear mask? Made of mother cedar, of course. Notice the thick black eyebrows, characteristic of Tlingit work. See the teeth, made of parts of a snail. See the typical Tlingit colors of red, green, and black again. See the real brown bear hide around the exterior. Face of a brown bear, isn't it? See the circle or ovoid, often, where there are, to relieve spaces. It's a typical Northwest Aboriginal piece of work, this mask is. Now, how can you have something as important in a culture as yellow cedar and not have a story? There were 3 native girls tending food by a campfire. Raven, the mischief maker, saw them, and Raven wanted the food. Raven thought, "I'll make a noise like a brown bear, and I'll frighten those girls away, and I'll steal their food." And he went, "Arr, like a brown bear," and the girls heard, but they didn't take fright. They laughed, and they said, "We know you're there, Raven. We're not afraid of brown bears anyway." And they went on with their food. And Raven sulked. He hid behind a spruce tree, and Raven thought, "I'll make a noise like a timber wolf, and I'll frighten those girls away, and I'll steal their food." And he went, "Ow!" And the girls heard, but they didn't take fright. They laughed, and they said, "We know you're there, Raven. And we're not afraid of timber wolves anyway. The only thing we're afraid of is owls." They probably shouldn't have said that, should they? Because you and I know that Raven is the great mimic, and Raven heard them say that, and Raven thought, "I can make a noise like an owl." And he hid behind a spruce tree, and he went, "Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo." The girls heard, and they took fright, and they ran up the mountainside. And when they got halfway up the mountainside, they stopped, and they turned, and they looked back, and when they stopped, their feet grew into the ground and became roots. and their arms grew into the great looping, graceful branches of the cedar tree, and they became cedar trees. Because as the Tlingits tell us, cedar tree is like woman. Cedar tree is graceful. Cedar tree smells good. And cedar tree is useful around the home. Well, have you got time and interest? Have you got time and interest both for one of the great adventure stories of all time that you haven't been told before, I'll guarantee you? Have you got time for a great retirement adventure story? That's what this is. The story begins in 1725. There's a man living in Russia named Peter the Great. He's Tsar of all Russia. He knows there's an America out there someplace, but he doesn't know where it is from Russia's east side. He decides he's going to discover America. He looks all over Russia for a sailor that can make this trip, and he locates a man named Vitus Bering. Bering, the Dane, the veteran of the Russian Navy, Bering, retired and living in Finland. He sends a message to Bering. It says, go and see if you can find America, and Bering went. Isn't the verb went the worst four-letter word in the English language? Doesn't tell you what Bering had to do in order to go and find America. That's what's left out of so much history. Bering went. Well, the first thing he had to do was to get from Finland to Kamchatka, 6,000 miles. Took him 3 years just to get to Kamchatka. Are we beginning to get understand? Now, he was retired, remember, so he's older. Then he had to build 2 vessels out of native wood by hand using the carpenters he took with him. Then he set sail eastward looking for America. He failed to find it. The irony of it is he would have seen it one day had it not been foggy. He failed, went back to Russia. He, along with Catherine, who had inherited the throne from Peter when he died, they decided that he should go back and do it again. This time he builds 2 bigger vessels out of native wood by hand, the St. Peter and the St. Paul, named them after the disciples. He was a devout Lutheran. Set sail eastward again with his 2 bigger boats. Took along another great figure of world history, a man named George Steller. Steller, the German scientist, the young, ambitious, egocentric Dr. Steller, took him along as ship's doctor. They sailed eastward. They ran into a storm. The St. Paul was lost in the storm. They never saw it again. St. Peter made land at Kayak Island in Prince William Sound. They had discovered America, but they didn't know it. There was an argument between these 2 devout Lutherans, Steller and Bering, over how much time could Steller have ashore. Steller wanted to take weeks there, find new flora and fauna, and become famous. Bering wanted to take fresh water and go home and die in bed. The upshot was that Steller got 11 hours on Kayak Island, and the 11 hours that he spent on Kayak Island causes the Western Hemisphere history to roll around for you folks, because Steller did find new flora and fauna, and he saw a bird, a particular bird, a bird that triggered his memory. He'd seen a bird like that, a drawing of a bird like that in a Russian museum. And he remembered the label underneath that bird in that Russian museum. The label was Carolina Jay. It was our blue jay. And this bird, while not identical, was so similar that Steller knew that he was indeed in America. And so it will always bear his name. And so they did discover America. And so we now have and always will have the Steller jay. And it's in the trees right around here, that beautiful bird. It too is like a girl I knew in San Francisco, because it has a brilliant plumage and a nasty disposition. Now, I suppose hopefully now that America has been discovered, you think the story's over, don't you? Well, folks, I am sorry to tell you that it is not over. How would you like to do something so marvelous in your retirement that you have a sea named after you, an island named after you, a trench named after you, a glacier named after you, and a cigar? here's all you have to do in the last 16 years of your retirement life. You have to discover a new continent. You better hurry, because there's not a lot of those left. And then you have to wreck your vessel on an island on the way home. And then you have to die of scurvy on that island. And then you have to be buried in the sand there by your shipmates, some of whom survive. And if you do all that, you can have a Bering Sea, a Bering Trench, a Bering Glacier, a Bering Island, a Bering Cigar. But I think it's going to a lot of trouble, don't you? The next thing that happens, upon that hangs the history of the Western Hemisphere. If you're from California, Oregon, or Washington, or British Columbia, or Alaska, and a lot of other places, you better listen to this part, because it's important to you. The survivors of that shipwreck made it back to Kamchatka the next summer, rebuilding a piece of wreckage into a boat small and enough so that they could get back to Kamchatka. They brought back with them something so important that it transfigures the history of the world. It triggers the invasion of the Aleutian Islands the next year by the Russians, the subjugation of the Aleuts for more than a century. And why? Because they brought back something, well, I'll give you a symbol of it. They brought back something so wonderful, so valuable, that it's important enough for you to remember from this whole trip. They brought back the furs of the sea otter and the fur seal. And thus begins the migration into Alaska in pursuit of those creatures because of their great wealth. And so what I brought to you is the symbol of the natural resource heritage of Alaska. Our state, more than any other, is dependent upon natural resources. Fish, salmon, timber, oil, gold, and first of all, fur. Now, fur is still a $2 million item in our budget every year. So you will go away from here remembering that Alaska is a natural resource state and that it all started with the wrecking of that Discovery vessel on Bering Island in 1741. So these are the furs that are taken here on Mitkoff Island every year. The surplus, remember the word sustainability? The surplus is taken every year, and this is one of the major fur bearers that we have all over Alaska. What is it? Take a guess. The animal that settled the West. The whole western United States settled because of this. Beaver. Beaver. Now, it is supremely appropriate for this little talk today. What do you think it is?
Bear.
No.
Beaver.
What is the history of Alaska all about? Sea otter. This is sea otter. This is a large male sea otter. And you may have seen it in the museum, but you're not going to get any closer than to this than you will today, because I'll leave it out and you can touch it and you can see why this valuable fur stimulated our history for the first 120 years of Alaskan history. And why the Russians chased this fur down through all the rim of Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, as far south as Fort Ross, California, because of this. Now, I'll show you. Only natives are allowed to take this hide nowadays because of the provisions of the Marine Mammal Act. So natives only can take these. This was taken by a native friend of mine from Petersburg. And only native people can work these hides. This was done by his wife, another friend of ours from Petersburg. Now, this Tlingit design that she did is in honor of my wife. You can see the characteristics of the eagle design, honoring my wife, who is an adopted eagle. If you look closely at the face in the middle, you see a thickened lip. That represents the labret that native women wore 100, 200 years ago for beauty, beautifying. They wore a labret in their lip. I'm going to put this away. You can see it afterwards if you want. Now, I hold in my hand the symbol of the next great economic thrust in Alaska. Coming after fur and becoming a major economic source in Alaska, major migration to Alaska because of this, beginning in about 1840, lasting till about 1920. Some people say this is an ancient Alaskan tool. Some people say that without this, there wouldn't be any more of this. Some people say that this represents the little-known fact that the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Alaska. Did no one tell you that Alaska is a Civil War state? Did no one ever mention to you that the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Alaska? Why not? It was because of this, and it's true. I'll give you another clue. New Bedford. Whaling! Whaling! This is the oosic of the killer whale. The penis bone of the killer whale. Well, without this, there wouldn't be any more of this now, would there? No. Would you like to examine this? Can't keep it. Pass it on. I want that back when this I want it back when this lecture's over. My wife told me to bring my oosic home every night. Yeah. So anyway, Captain Roy, in search of whales after they had used up the whales of the North Atlantic. The whole whaling fleet looked for whales to keep the North American economy going. Captain Roy left and went round South America. He went to the Bering Sea finally. These trips took 3 or 4 years. And he found bowhead whale in the Bering Sea, and he filled his boat with the oil of the bowhead whale, and he went back to New Bedford, and thus starts the rush to Alaska. Whole whaling fleet left. Along comes the Civil War. Pretty soon it's 1863. The Confederacy says if we don't do something about northern industry, we might lose the Civil War. Northern industry runs on whale oil, and their sailors come from the whaling fleet. The Northern Navy sailors come from the whaling fleet. If we could sink their whaling fleet, we could eliminate their source of oil and their source of seamen. So they found Captain Waddell in the Confederate Navy. They sent Captain Waddell to England to get a boat called the Shenandoah, a gunship. Captain Waddell went to England, got the Shenandoah, headed it around Africa to Australia, and then to Hawaii, and then to the Bering Sea, and there he accosted our whaling fleet. And in 3 weeks' time, he sank or burned to the waterline 38 whaling ships. He couldn't find any more to sink. Where are the Californians in here? This is for you. He headed for San Francisco, Captain Waddell did, on the Shenandoah, with a stated intent of capturing the city of San Francisco for the Confederacy. Now, lucky for you Californians, Waddell stopped another boat before he got to San Francisco, because I think he would have captured it. He stopped another boat, and on that boat there was a newspaper, and the newspaper had the word Appomattox on the front page. And Captain Waddell realized when he read the paper that not only was the Civil War over, it was over for a month before he sank his first whaling ship. And that makes it the last battle of the Civil War, and if you don't believe it, get a book called Confederate Raiders in the North Pacific. That's one of the books that tells about it. How's that story for a bit of trivia to take home with you? Well, I'm about done here. I wanted to tell you about the gold rush, but there's really not time. I'll get around it this way. I wanted the gold and I sought it. I scrabbled and mucked like a slave. Was it famine or scurvy? I fought it. I hurled my youth into the grave. I wanted the gold and I got it. Came out with a fortune last fall. Yet somehow life's not what I thought it. And somehow the gold isn't all. It's the land. Have you seen it? It's the cussedest land that I know, with the big, dizzy mountains that screen it to the deep, death-like valleys below. Some say God was tired when he made it. Some say it's a fine land to shun. maybe. But there's some that would trade it for no land on earth, and I'm one. Well, in 1927, Alaska's governor, Governor Parks, went to Washington, D.C., and there he saw that every state, most of the territories had their own flags, and Alaska had no flag. He went back to the legislative halls in Juneau and he said, how are we going to ever become a state if we don't have a flag? That body did what those kinds of bodies often do. They appointed a committee to study that problem. The committee came up with a flag design contest, and 150 school children entered the contest. And this one, the winner, was done by Benny Benson. Benny was an Aleut native boy living in an orphanage in the Aleutian Islands, and he, at the age of 12, designed this flag. The committee looked at it. They said, boy, we sure like Benny's flag. We like the blue as a field of blue. It represents the blue of the sea and the sky. We like that. We like gold as a secondary color, stands for the riches that we think are still under the ground in Alaska. And we like Ursa Major, the Great Bear, the Big Dipper, stands for strength. We like Polaris, the North Star, stands for the direction finder, for the prospector and the mariner, and they chose this flag then, and then we did become a state, didn't we? 32 years later, it takes time for these things. But we became a state in 1959. A man that some of you will remember, a man named Ike Eisenhower, signed his name on a piece of paper that made Alaska the 49th state. Now, believe this if you will. It was emotional for many Alaskans to become a member of the Union. And when that announcement came in, there was some rejoicing. There was some emotional reaction. Our Alaskan delegation there in Washington, D.C., where the signing took place, included Greening and included Bartlett, included Senator Stevens and his wife, included later Governor Bill Egan and his wife Neva, and they observed President Eisenhower sign us into the 49th state of the United States of America. But here's the main idea. When it was over, our Alaskan delegation adjourned, and they reassembled in the Senate chapel, and they gave thanks for becoming a member of the United States of America. And at that Thanksgiving ceremony, Neva Egan, who was the wife of the governor, sang the Alaska flag song. 8 stars of gold on a field of blue, Alaska's flag may it mean to you. The blue of the sea, the evening sky, the mountain lakes and the flowers nearby. The gold of the early sourdough's dreams, the precious gold of the hills and streams. The brilliant stars in the northern sky, the Bear, the Dipper, and climbing high, the great North Star with its steady light. O'er land and sea a beacon bright, Alaska's flag, to Alaskans dear, the simple flag of a last frontier.